Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking about whether or not it's a good idea to cross-train in Iaido if you already do Kendo, or I suppose you could consider this vice versa. So if you already do Iaido, should you be thinking about possibly doing Kendo? There's pros and cons for both, and it's going to come down to a few points that really you need to reflect on. I don't think that it's really right for anyone to tell you that it's a good idea or not. So I'm going to elaborate on that. Let's just get stuck into it, and you'll see why that is. Budo's about reflection, so I'm just going to throw a couple of things at you that you can think about, and you should be able to reflect on the matter and make your decision quite comfortably from there. So while I discuss everything, please bear in mind the old adage from Ozawa Sensei's book, The Definitive Guide of Kendo, which I will link above in the top of the video around about now. If you run after two hares, you'll catch none. So please consider that phrase as we go through the video. Okay, so here's a couple of points that I want to throw at you. The first off is, why did you start Kendo? Or why did you start Iai? And why do you continue? Are those two reasons the same? So the reason, whatever brought you to Kendo, is that still why you stay at Kendo? Basically, think about why do you do Kendo or Iai and what keeps you coming back. Because people start for different reasons. There's some people that I think, maybe have a really romanticized image of what it might be like, and maybe come from, say, the likes of the manga community. And then they arrive at Kendo and they discover it's a very different thing. It's not really that flashy when you get down to it. It's pretty simple and straightforward, and there's a lot of repetitiveness. And that can put off a lot of people, and they end up leaving at that point. But if you choose to stay, what is it that made you stay? Because clearly your perception of the way of the sword and what you imagine that to be has changed. So why do you continue? And that could be down to a whole range of things. Maybe you're really into the history side of it. Maybe you really like the Shiai, the competitive side of it, and the full contact nature of it. Some people really like kata in Kendo, but they're not necessarily that fussed on the competitive side, the Shiai side. These are all important points to understand, because you should be asking yourself what you want from your practice of Kendo, or indeed, if it's Iaido, what do you want from your practice of Iaido? Because in Iai, it has its own set of challenges. So maybe you turned up and you were expecting to know how to fight with a sword. And sure, you're going to learn how to cut, and you'll learn how to envisage where opponents are and the right distance, and great kamae, and fortifying a strong mental attitude, and keeping high concentration levels. All these things are they're great attributes, but they don't show you what it's like to be in a sword fight. Kendo is much closer in that regard to showing you what a sword fight would be like. But even that, Kendo is not a sword fight. It's learning together. That's not to say that you can't glean some information about what sword fighting is about from that, or what fighting is about as a whole, because Kendo is a bit unique compared to some traditional martial arts in that, because of the nature of how we go kind of sparring together and the high intensity and high pressure of the training, there's a very, very strong focus on pressure throughout Kendo, different levels of pressure and how you deal with it. Because of that, it takes you quite close to outright combat sport without actually being an outright combat sport, if that makes sense. So I'll climb into that a little bit further, maybe a bit further down the video. But the importance to take away from that is what brought you to your martial art, and why do you keep doing it? So the next point I want you to consider is, how's that actually going for you? Yeah, is it is it working out well? Do you feel like you're making steady progress all the time? Maybe you feel like you're making rapid progress. That's great if that happens. I don't think it happens to a lot of people. For most people, it should be steady progress. Or maybe you feel like you're not really getting very far with it. You know, you're kind of stuck in the mud. Now, that's important to bear in mind if you're going to cross train, because if you're not coping that well with the one that you're doing, you should be really concerned about whether or not you're going to be able to cope with doing two martial arts. Okay, so give that serious consideration. The next thing I want you to think about is, what level of practitioner are you? Are you a beginner kendoka or beginner iaidoka? Are you kind of in the middle ranks? So a beginner, I would say, is anybody up to maybe shodan, nidan sort of level. I would say is fair. And it's not to say that everyone's skill level is exactly the same by rank. I'm not saying that. I'm just using it as the best approximation or generalization that I can make in this case. If you're intermediate level, I would start thinking of that from sort of like Sandan to Godan, right? I think that's fair enough. I don't think the Godans will be offended, right? And then if you're like, advanced level, then I think it's got to be, 6 dan or above. I think that's a good system that kind of works for everybody and is respectful to everybody. If you're a beginner, you haven't really wrapped your head around the fundamentals. So whether you're Iaidoka or Kendoka, you haven't really got command of the basics properly. And you might say to me, "Oh no, I know the basics. I know how to do this cut, know how to do that cut." But it needs to be polished to a certain point where that is, that is your Iaido. It's not to say that that's what you can do on your best day. It's that's what you're capable of on your worst day. Yeah, when you wake up and you roll out of bed, how's your EI look or how's your Kendo look, right? In other words, you have full command of that level. And for most Kendoka, having a full command of the basics usually happens around 3rd dan. So that's why I use that distinction. And I think it's from what I've seen from Iaido, I don't have as much experience in EI. I've only been doing EI for probably about 3 years now, maybe coming on 3 years or something like that. Maybe a little bit over, I'm not sure. Kind of lose track. But I've been doing Kendo in 3 years. It'll be 17 years. In 3 years' time, it'll be 20 years I've been doing Kendo. And yeah, it's important to consider whether you have a firm grounding in the basics, because the movements in EI, for example, footwork wise, and footwork's a great thing to talk about because it's critically important in Iaido. And if you take your Kendo footwork across to Iaido, it's not going to work. It's not going to give you the balance and the kind of steadiness, the immovability that you need to do what you need to do in Iaido, to keep the kama you need to keep. Kendo's a bit of a different movement. You're kind of driving forward through the opponent. There's a lot of power and energy that's developed from the way you use your feet in Kendo. And people have a misunderstanding that it comes from your arms and your shoulders, and it's wrists, fingers, and your hips, and your feet. It's what's going on with those elements that really generates the power and the snap in your cut. In Iaido, it's a different set of circumstances. You're often cutting from a static position, and you're using full large cuts, and you're doing it with a sword, which is balanced completely differently from a shinai. The weight is right towards the front, really. Don't get me wrong, you get Iaido with better balance than others. Where obviously they bring a bit of the weight more towards the center of the sword or back towards the scar bit, but they can't do what they can do with the shinai. Shinai is a really, really easy thing to wield compared to a sword in some ways. Anyway, the point is that it's a very different set of footwork. It's much wider apart. Your hips sit a bit lower, so there tends to be a bit more bend in the knees. There's a couple of nuances to it, and When I started Iaido, I'd been doing Kendo for 16, no, where are we? Probably 13 or 14 years. Yeah, 13, 14 years. I'd been doing Kendo. And I just couldn't make my footwork large enough. Um, we had a weekend seminar, and my Iaido sensei got us started with it, taught us the basic seite forms, and we had a little embu at the end of the weekend. And the one thing he kept noting was you're going to struggle with the footwork, chopping and changing between the footwork. And that's somebody who's been doing kendo for a long time. So you can see the challenge there. It's going to be tricky to go back and forth between the two. And if you're a beginner, I think you're opening up a can of worms because it can really mess around with what you're trying to train into muscle memory. And if you turn up at a kendo grading and you've got this really like wide footwork during your kirikaeshi and you get failed for it, you're going to be really upset with yourself because you've failed basically because you're trying to tackle too much at once, not because you're doing Iaido and Kendo together. It's because of when you started doing Iaido and Kendo together. Okay, let's move on to the next point, which is basically, do you have a physical issue which might make one more practical than the other, or one, particularly difficult to train than the other? So maybe you've got really, really, really bad knees, or you've got issues with your feet. Maybe you've torn your Achilles heel before in some other kind of physical activity. I don't know, playing tennis or something like that when you're a kid or earlier in life. It's really important to consider that because in Kendo, although people can do Kendo from a very young age, as young as sort of 4 or 5 years old in Japan, and all the way, into like the 90s, I think, there was a couple of really old sensei who have even, turned up and been 102 years old, and they're still doing it. That being said, if you have very severe difficulties, it might mean that Kendo's off the cards for you because you are going to end up in full contact, high impact situations with a lot of dynamic energy going through all those sort of joints. Particularly the Achilles heel, hamstrings, the feet themselves. Do you have some sort of history of head injury or spinal injury that might make it difficult to actually receive the strikes? The armor protects you pretty well, but you're still getting struck repeatedly on the head. Sometimes hundreds of times a day or thousands of times a day. That's an important thing to consider. Whereas Iaido has no contact. I mean, there sometimes can be some minor contact impaired practice, but generally it's solo forms. The opponent is really in your mind, and it's yourself, as it is in Kendo. But in Kendo, you have a reference by having a partner to practice with and engage with. But the basics is, Iaido is obviously I would say a fair bit easier on the body in the long run than Kendo. Kendo is more likely to cause you injury. So that's something to think about as to which one you would pick, and if you're already doing one, would you be capable of doing another? So if you're already doing Kendo and you have a few bugs and niggles, but they don't really get in the way of your Kendo, yeah, you can, for sure, you should be able to do Iai. Don't see a reason why not. But if you do Iaido and you have some, bugs and niggles and things like that, I would be cautious about trying Kendo. I'm not saying don't try Kendo. I'm just saying be cautious about it. Okay. Right, so those are like the main 4 points I just wanted to bring up, and some things to throw at you that you can reflect on. So if the reason that you started Kendo is something like, you wanted to learn all about Japanese swordsmanship and you're interested in the history of it, you don't just want it to be stick fighting, you want it to go deeper than that. But you are really interested in the swordsmanship side of things, then cross-training Kendo and Iaido can be a really great idea because it can be a much fuller experience that way. But you don't need it. You don't need to do both to appreciate that, because it's based on, to excel in either one of them, you need to do your own self-reflection and your own learning. So if you do that, you can probably start to glean a lot of that information anyway to a point. Okay. As I said, the second question was, how's that going for you? So are you able to cope? If you're coping really well with what you've got on your plate at the moment, then yeah, you'll know that within yourself that you can cope and commit and continue with more. And when I say that, I mean, if there's 3 practices available in your dojo for Kendo a week, and you only show up for 1 a week or less, probably a bad idea to try and take on another martial art, because it looks like you can't commit to it. Okay, but if you're showing up to 2 out of 3 sessions a week most weeks, and maybe doing the occasional one where you're hitting all 3 or something like that, and the only breaks you take are like for holidays or whatever, and you can spare a bit more time to do the second martial art to complement it without bringing death and destruction and inconvenience to your family members and your friends and, you know, people in your regular everyday life. Let's forget, we're not swordsmen for a living. You know, we do this as an interest and a study and a means of self-improvement. So think about the consequences of your action in the rest of your world, yeah? Kendo and Iaido is not supposed to be somewhere where you just go for an escape. It's supposed to directly impact the way you live your life and integrate with society around you. Okay, so don't think of it as an escape. It's not fantasy television. Like I said, consider your level. If you're a beginner, I advise hanging on. Just wait, just give it a bit of time. You know, acquire a good level with what you're doing already, and consider cross-training starting later. If you're intermediate or advanced, I have no business telling an advanced practitioner, you know, what they should do about their own training. But if you're intermediate, you probably start to know this within yourself. You should know the answer to this within yourself already, because you should be reflecting on your own practice. If you're a martial artist, you're expressing yourself through your martial arts. And as a beginner, you're not capable of doing that yet. As an intermediate, you should be. You should be able to do that. If you're not doing that, you need to think about why that is. Okay, so let's make the case for cross-training Iaido from Kendo or vice versa. So the first point is going to be sword handling and understanding. So if you're coming at this, like I said from the questions earlier, from the perspective that, you know, you're interested in the martial side of the martial art and you're interested in swordsmanship, maybe you have an interest in the history of things as well and the reason why certain things are the way they are in either Kendo or Iaido, then it's a great idea to cross-train. I think for the understanding of sword handling, particularly from, if you're coming from Kendo going to Iaido, because the shinai is a good approximation and it allows us to strike each other, but you can definitely get away with quite a lot, I would say, in Kendo for cutting technique, which is not to say that people are rubbish or something like that, but they're not fully challenged with the shinai. Often things are missed in the heat of shiai, and ippon awarded, where the strike is maybe actually not, you know, particularly high quality as far as cutting technique is concerned. But in the context of what they're looking for in terms of yukoda tatsu, the requirements for ippon, it's enough, if that makes sense. Whereas for an Iaidoka, they would look at that and go, how could you award a point for that? That cut wasn't straight. You know, it barely clipped the front of his nose, but it did hit the armor, but you scored it. You know, they don't really understand that all the other criteria that we're looking for in ippon and kendo. But it's a good point. If you want to pursue that further and learn about the details of sword handling and really push your cutting technique and your understanding of what you can take back to the shinai, I think it's of benefit. Next thing is better understanding of kamae. So kamae is not just the way you stand, but it's a position where you're truly ready to move, ready to respond. And you've got two forms of that. You've got kikamaya, which is the readiness of your spirit, so that's alertness. Are you really switched on to what's happening, every little thing that's happening in the encounter? And then there's migamaya, which is the readiness of the body, which should reflect that readiness of the mind. So it's one thing just standing there in chudan and looking pretty, but is it really ready to move and explode with full commitment when it needs to? And you can learn that on its own in Kendo. You don't need EI to do it. But I think you can get a more complete understanding of Kamae because there are certain things that are just done a bit differently in EI. For example, you'll often finish with your feet much further apart. Like your right foot much further forward than your left foot, than you would in Kendo. In Kendo, you could fail a grading for leaving your your back foot far behind. Yeah, that's the consideration there is there's no hiketsuke, which you need to launch consecutive attacks. And that's very important value in Kendo. In Iaido, it's a little bit different because the encounters are laid out a little bit different because it's all in kata format. The position of the feet is often best placed for balancing and handling your balance for a static cutting position. So in other words, you're not cutting while driving forward and moving through the opponent or into the opponent. You're standing your ground and cleaving them down. And the cuts that you would use in Iaido are like, if they're executed properly, there's no question they're killing blows. Like you're going to cleave the person, right? In Kendo, it's not required. You don't need all of that. Basically, it's distilled down to a few very important techniques. If you cut him between the eyes and you cleave his head down to eye level, that should be enough to drop him. Yeah, if you execute a good kote, he'll not be using the hand anymore. That's enough. If you execute a good door strike, they'll not be standing up and fighting anymore. If you were to take it to its logical conclusion, that's what I'm trying to get at. In Iaido, it's different. It's like there's no room for error on that. There's much more of a focus placed on cutting technique, and the cuts are executed to their full. There's no compromise on the cut to make way or space for the fact that you may need to move on to 50 other guys coming at you or something like that. And it's just different. It's just different. You're standing on the spot and you're going to cut maybe 3 or 4 people, probably maximum, who are coming at you from different places. It's just different. You have to experience it as well. But they're not coming at you like hairy bears. And this makes my next point as well. So the reasons for your actions. So you'll learn about the reasons for your actions in these kata and why you need to think that way. It's very important to the study of Iaido. And you learn about that in Kendo as well, but I think you tend to start climbing into that a bit later in Kendo than you do for Iaido, because you need it right away to do any EI. You need to know why you're doing stuff. Controlling the hara and engaging the hara. I think this is a very important point as well. Again, it tends to come to Kendoka a bit later, usually around 3rd dan, maybe 4th dan if they're lucky. Where people are really starting to engage their hips and drive their hips forward. You need to get a handle on that, I think, a little earlier. It doesn't come easy to anyone, but it comes a little earlier than in Kendo, I think, in EI. So if you're in that intermediate group of experience, and you've been doing Kendo for several years and you're just starting to get into that, if you start EI now, you'll probably pick it up quite quickly because it'll just give you the kick up your backside to really start focusing on that. And there it can be of a clear benefit, I think. You'll get a deeper understanding of Reiho and etiquette as well. The etiquette and Reiho, in Reigi, in Iaido is, if anything, much stricter than Kendo. And Kendo can already be pretty strict for most people's experience. If maybe they've done karate before or judo or something like that. Usually when people turn up at a Kendo dojo, they're like, wow, you guys are really strict with etiquette. Iaido is even more strict. So if you haven't done it, you'll learn more on that. and it'll all be really pleasant. You know, you'll if you enjoy that side of kendo, if you enjoy doing mokuso, if you enjoy small details in your kata and things like that, I think you get real enjoyment from learning the etiquette side from Iaido, but it'll just further your knowledge of that as well. And there may be some things that you've heard of in kendo that don't get practiced anymore. So like putting your hands in a diamond shape when you do, the ray from Seiza at the beginning and end of each practice. You put your hands in the diamond. Now, it used to be in the old days, many clubs would put the left hand down first, then the right hand, and then when you finished the bow, the right hand came back first, then the left hand. Whereas in modern kendo, the thinking is very much to put the hands down together. In Iaido, it doesn't work that way. It's the traditional ways, and it's explained why that is as well, because it's a readiness of the spirit. It's the way of the spirit sort of thing. So there's reasons for that. And then there's a different kind of mental pressure. The mental pressure that comes in kendo is very much like, it comes at like a sort of real conflict kind of pacing. Yeah, this person's coming at you. They don't want to get struck, but they want to strike you, and they're not going to just let you. They're not going to just let you win, right? At least when you're doing shiai, yeah, when it's a competitive situation. Obviously, at other points, you're learning together and that sort of thing, so it's a bit different. It sort of comes as a scaled kind of pressure, so you've got like your basic training where there's no pressure at all. Then you've got like uchikomi keiko, little bit more pressure to do everything kind of perfectly and get on with it a bit. Kakari keiko, turn the heat up quite a lot, yeah, and you're going at them with everything you got, and you get taken to your limit. Jikeiko, maybe a little less pressure because you're just there to trial your techniques out, but most of us, our ego gets in the way and puts more pressure on than needs to be there. And then Shiai is like maximum pressure because you're going there to test together. So you're going, right, where's my kendo at? And we're going to, win or lose, and why is that? And you got to treat it like Ippon Shobu, even if it's Sanbon Shobu. Yeah, make it best of one in your head instead of best of three. And then be thankful that you get another chance. Anyway, the point is that in Iaido, the pressure comes a little bit differently. So it's like when you do your kata in kendo, and you get people starting to tell you, you need to do your kata in one breath. And you think, how do I do that? Some people know what I'm talking about and can do it. Other people try to do it, but they know they don't really do it. And then there's people that maybe haven't heard of this. But yeah, you'll get teachers who ask you, you've got to do this in one breath. You think, well, why is that? And when you treat kata very seriously to a very high level, you're trying to do some of the stuff that's similar to kendo in terms of your concentration levels, keeping them really elevated. And but in Iaido, it's a lot bigger challenge to do that in a kata format because you don't have a partner to work with. There's no one to look at. You have to visualize where everything's going to happen, and you'll be held accountable for it. You will have teachers who will be like, who are you cutting at? They're not standing there. They're standing here. You did, and the reason why you didn't notice because you haven't got this bit of footwork down. And the thing is, you're left to deal with that inside your own head. Yeah, there's no one else to reflect it back to you. You have to learn to reflect it back to yourself in order to learn your lessons and progress. Now, that's not all true because you have a teacher and teacher guides you and so on. But on Kendo, Kendo makes it a little easier, I think, because you have a partner to show you the way in the beginning, whereas EI doesn't have that. And so that's a benefit you can do by training, cross-training, both. And again, I think it comes with experiences to appreciate it. So if you're intermediate or higher level in one or the other, swapping isn't going to hurt you, it's going to help you. But these benefits, we're talking increments. Yeah, it's not going to like revolutionize your kendo overnight. Yeah, by starting Iaido, it's not going to do that. It's going to add over time and enrich over time steadily. And the same goes in reverse. Okay, so let's make the case against cross training. Why wouldn't you? Yeah, because so far it's sounding pretty good. Um, and this goes back to some of my questions earlier about, where are you in your Kendo? What level are you? Have you got it down? Or in your EI indeed? Have you got it down? Are you coping? Are you a beginner? You're asking those questions. And the reason is because it may form bad habits, particularly in your footwork, that may cause you to fail gradings, and then you'll become disheartened, and the whole thing could become an unpleasant experience because you took on too much and you weren't really coping with the first one yet. So I'd bear that in mind. Another thing is, like, it was described to me when I started EI as, are you sure you want to open a fresh can of horrors? And again, this goes back to the are you coping question. Like I said, if you're not really able to make practice with, like clockwork with what you're already doing, there's a good chance you're not going to be able to stick it with the other thing as well, and it might be even worse because that's the newer one for you, so you probably take it less seriously than the one you're already established in. So yeah, are you sure you want to do it? Another thing is, does your club or dojo actually have the means to do it? So I'm quite fortunate in that our club, although it's quite isolated in the world, we have a sister club that has a strong tradition in Kendo, Iaido, and Jodo. And so we have a very good direct link there. We also have friends in the Republic of Ireland, and they also run Kendo, Iaido, and Jodo. And so we have some resources to lean on, which helped us to get Iaido and Jodo started in Northern Ireland. Not every club is that fortunate. Will you have access to teachers, people to stop you going off on the wrong path, making mistakes, bedding in habits that are going to harm you and hinder you rather than help you? Something to think about. If you've got the network there and people to rely on, then that's great. That's a really helpful thing to get started. But if you don't have that, are you going to be missing that much if you decide not to do it, as opposed to kind of forcing yourself to do it without guidance? I'd consider that point very carefully. And my last point is that, do you actually really need it? There's, Kendo, like I said earlier, people can start really young at like 4 or 5 years old in Japan, practice their whole lives, maybe even become a police officer, and they may even reach some of the pinnacle tournaments and compete in the All Japan Kendo Championships and things like that. And they may never reach Hachidan. That's the reality of it. So there's enough in Kendo for even the most dedicated, hard training people to maybe never quite reach their full, technical potential in the martial art. So it's a lot. It's a lot to deal with. So do you really need a second one that's equally difficult to add on to that, you know, list of worries that you have to deal with day by day? And remember, you've got family and friends in real life to deal with as well. But you know, if you've listened to all of this, so I'm just going to sum it up now and finish it. So remember I brought up that old adage from Ozawa Sensei's book. Um, if you run after two hares, you'll catch none. If you've bear that in mind while listening to this talk, and you're still really excited about cross training, and you've answered kind of yes more than no in a lot of instances when you've searched yourself for the answer, then I think it's probably a very good idea for you. You sound like the kind of person that will cope mentally. You'll cope quite well with cross training into Budo, and there are people who do it successfully. I know a good few of them, but just remember that it's not make or break for your kendo if you don't do Iaido. There's plenty of kendoka that do reach the highest levels, the very highest levels, that don't necessarily do both. They just do the one. And the same, I'm sure, is true in Iaido. I'm not as familiar with the high-level sensei in Iaido, but I'm sure the same is true. because there's something to be said for having a single-minded focus on things. This is the same reason why high-level kendo teachers warn people against taking Jodan or Nito lightly. Yeah, because getting kendo under control in Chudan is difficult enough. Yeah, and a lot of times people think they're much better at it than they really are. So you should be weary and you should just carefully consider these things. But ultimately, it's your martial arts practice, so it's your choice. All the rest of us can do, who are in positions where we coach, or like little old me with a YouTube channel, we can say what our perspective is from our experience and try to guide people and be helpful, but we can't make your mind up for you. You have to do it for yourself. And like I said, yeah, it's all about self-reflection. So that's where I'm going to leave it. But certainly, if you come at Budo from the perspective of swordsmanship, as opposed to maybe it's the reasons why some other people would start Kendo, like community, hanging with your friends on the weekends at Chi and stuff like that. Um, if you're coming at from maybe a bit more of a traditional perspective, or maybe the lineage just exists in your dojo, so you figure, well, I'll give that a go because that seems to be the way of this club. By all means, have a go. Yeah, just bear in mind it's difficult it's difficult enough as it is with just Kendo or just Iaido or just Jodo. Jodo's the worst, actually. Some of their kata look terrifying, like so complex. Anyway, that's where I'm going to leave it today. It's been a big old chat. Thanks for listening to me. I know it gets kind of boring just listening to someone talking on. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there. Make your own mind up, and ultimately, you only have to be responsible, to yourself and to those who depend upon you. All right, take care. Have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Bye bye.